In some ways, designing and producing a retro motorcycle can be more difficult for manufacturers than even high-tech sport bikes or adventure bikes. There are so many decisions to make. What kind of retro motorcycle are you going to develop? A modern, sporty motorcycle with modern tech and performance, maybe just kind of dressed up like a classic? If that is the case, how are you going to go about keeping the classic look while hiding things like the radiator? Or maybe you want to create a motorcycle that emulates the spirit of a classic motorcycle, or you can go further and try to copy the actual form of classic bikes. But once you've figured that all out, you're still not done. Which classic motorcycles from which era are you going to be copying? British motorcycles from the 60s, Italian sport bikes from the 70s, or are you going to create a bike that sort of blends lots of these aspects? Or maybe you want to make a kind of neo-retro motorcycle with only a few nods to the past. Who's your audience? Is it new riders? Is it returning riders? All of these things will determine what the bike looks like, what it costs, and how it performs and rides. The motorcycle we're looking at today is in some ways quite misunderstood simply because it answers these questions a bit different than most retro motorcycles. The entire approach is somewhat unique. You know, there was a time not that long ago when this whole retro market didn't really exist. Through the 80s and 90s, manufacturers focused their R&D efforts primarily on performance, but as the turn of the century approached, there was a growing desire among riders for those great classic bikes, you know, their look, their feel, and around this time, quite a few old, previously dead legacy motorcycle manufacturers were revived. Think Triumph and MV Agusta. Now, there were classically styled motorcycles that kind of never changed. Think Yamaha's SR models and of course Royal Enfield's, basically never changing lineup. Perhaps the first true retro motorcycle that is a motorcycle made brand new from the ground up, designed and purposefully built to look and feel old was Honda's GB500. Now that motorcycle was a total flop, perhaps in part because of the motorcycles it was emulating, clubman styled British singles from the late 50s and 60s. There's also this one weird Suzuki motorcycle, but we don't even need to talk about that. In all reality, the first modern classic motorcycle that would really set a sort of precedent for what modern classic roadster style motorcycles would be going forward was actually a bike made by Kawasaki. The Kawasaki W story goes all the way back to the 1960s. At this time, the Japanese manufacturers were experiencing massive growth both domestically and abroad, but only really with small displacement sort of economy bikes. But a large segment of the Western markets wanted larger displacement sport bikes, and Kawasaki wanted to have a leg up on the competition, so they made a bold move and purchased Japan's oldest motorcycle manufacturer, Meguro, with the hopes of continuing to develop their larger, sportier motorcycles. The truth is, Meguro was struggling at this point that Kawasaki took over, thanks to Honda essentially killing them in their home market. Meguro's K-Series was in essence a BSA clone, but Kawasaki saw potential in it. After much development, the result would be the W1, a 650cc parallel twin targeted directly at the American market. It was thoroughly British in form, though still retaining elements of Japanese design from this time. In terms of performance, it was right on par with Triumph and BSA's parallel twin 650s, making about 50 horsepower, and it was a success for Kawasaki in part because it helped to really build Kawasaki's reputation as a forward-thinking Japanese manufacturer capable of competing in any class. One could even argue that the W1 really started the Japanese engineering and horsepower wars. Now, of course, Kawasaki would focus their motorcycle development in other places, but they stayed committed to this W platform. This British-esque big bike managed to hold a level of popularity primarily in Japan as the British motorcycle industry kind of waned and the universal Japanese motorcycle took over. Production of Ws would end in '74, and it appeared that this kind of British-styled Kawasaki Twin series would be done for good. I mean, in what world would there be a market for this kind of niche motorcycle again? Fast forward to the 1990s, and Kawasaki was right in the thick of the horsepower wars, developing more insane, powerful, technologically advanced motorcycles every year. But now a new, potentially profitable, but different kind of motorcycle market was emerging, that of the retro-styled bike. Cafe racer and classic motorcycle enthusiasm was really at an all-time high, with custom builders working overtime to make their bikes look like the iconic British motorcycles of old. The Ace Cafe had just been reopened, and with the rebirth of Triumph, it was only a matter of time before they would jump on the bandwagon with the re-release of the Bonneville. But no Japanese manufacturer had any sort of true, authentic, British-styled bike from their history, well, except Kawasaki, of course. And so Kawasaki got to work designing an all-new, old, modern, but classic motorcycle, the W650. Kawasaki made quite a few interesting design choices with this motorcycle, starting with the engine. At this point in time in the 90s, pretty much all manufacturers of parallel twin engines had moved away from the classic 360-degree firing order, that is, both pistons rising and falling at the same time, but with only one firing, to what companies like Honda had popularized with their twins, the 180-degree firing order, a revier and smoother and more economical, but definitely less characterful setup. Classic Japanese twins with that 180-degree firing order have a quite different feel and sound, as shown here, versus the British twins. So for this motorcycle, Kawasaki decided to go back to that original 360-degree crank to give their new, modern classic motorcycle a level of old-school charm. Of course, the engine had to be air-cooled and also carbureted, and they gave the engine the classic half-black engine paint and, sort of curvy shape. But on the inside of the overhead cam 4-valve engine, it was thoroughly modern. It had a counterbalance shaft to deal with the extra vibrations from that firing order. One interesting departure from the classic W's was this beautiful bevel drive found more commonly on classic Italian bikes. Now, practically speaking, this was really only better for maintenance in some ways, but more importantly, it was just an interesting, almost nerdy feature that helped the bike stand out. And those of you who are W650 and W800 enthusiasts, they'll tell you that this is one of their favorite aspects of the bike. Nobody was doing this at this time, and still nobody's doing this, except Kawasaki with the W. A bevel drive on a classic British twin. For some reason, it just looks fantastic. And it's why this is still, in my opinion, the best looking production motorcycle engine that you can get. In terms of overall engineering, the W was thoroughly modern with a disc brake up front, electronic ignition, a modern clutch, a 5-speed gearbox, better tolerances of course, and a whopping 50 horsepower, something that would never change really for the Kawasaki W. That's pretty much as much power as it's ever made. Now, we haven't really touched on the most interesting aspect of this motorcycle, which is of course the overall style and design, and this gets at the original questions of just what kind of retro motorcycle a manufacturer can try to make. On the one hand, there were nods to the original W series from the 60s, like for example, okay, I'm just going to challenge you to look closely at this, reborn Kawasaki W650 and compare it to the original W1. And I want you to find one example of any sort of nod to the original version besides things that are, just parts of obvious motorcycle styling from the 60s. Like, even the way the front, metal mudguard is held in place, it's even different, There are things like fork gaiters, but even the fork gaiters are different. The entire stance of the bike, the handlebars, the seat, it's not really designed to look like this original W. The engine looks nothing like the W1. Even the entire tank logo looks different. But in many ways, the W650 was only a W in name. And it was actually styled to look much more like a different motorcycle, the iconic Triumph Bonneville and just Triumph twins from the 60s. For example, the tank emblem and the fork gaiters, the exhaust shape, the gauges. On the W1, the gauges are held in a kind of nacelle like a lot of Japanese bikes from this time. But no, this looks like a Triumph. The pinstripe on the seat looks just like a 60s Bonneville, or especially from the early 60s and late 50s, really. I mean, you could be justified, and many have, for mistaking the W650 for actually being an original Triumph Bonneville because it looks just like it. It is bigger, like the tank and overall shape, but the proportions of the bike are spot on. Something that actually, in my opinion, Triumph has never quite nailed as well as Kawasaki did with this. In all reality, Kawasaki was brilliant for this. There were no rules for this kind of new market that was retro bikes, and their own W1 didn't really have quite the relevant styling. Triumph did. And if you say, oh no, it just looks like a BSA from this time, not a Triumph, it doesn't. It looks like a Bonneville, and everyone knows this. It doesn't look that much like a BSA. Interestingly enough, Triumph themselves were in the process of designing their own Bonneville copy, set to be released shortly after the W650, but it was being developed at the same time. I'm not sure if Kawasaki got some sort of like insider information and they wanted to beat Triumph to the punch. We don't really know. What we do know is that this was designed to look like Triumph's iconic twins from the 60s all the way down to the tank badge. And upon its release, journalists and riders found something else. Thanks to its 360-degree firing order and classic riding stance, the bike even managed to feel like those great British twins and sound like them. Here's what Cycle World's David Edwards had to say about the W650 when it was released. The modern retrograde motorcycle has almost become a parody, a cartoonish exaggeration of old-timey, two-wheeled mechanical elements, seemingly ever larger, heavier, and more complex. A new old bike's true mechanical nature is often utterly at odds with the spiritual essence of what the manufacturer is trying to accomplish, which is to pander to our desire for simpler machines and simpler times. It ends up being a sort of Rube Goldberg approach to satisfying nostalgia. The 2000 Kawasaki W650 doesn't feel this way. There certainly are concessions to modernity and its attendant conveniences, but the core elements that make motorcycle exist in a pleasantly pure form have survived relatively unfettered. He also says later on this: for personality is one of the biggies with a motorcycle like this. Balance shafted and rubber mounted, the 360-degree parallel twin nonetheless exerts its character. Does it shake and tingle like an old Bonnie? Nope. Wouldn't want it to either. It's got enough rhythmic boogie to let you know you're riding a proper motorbike without punishing you for it. Retro motorcycles weren't at this time what they are today, and these journalists were just kind of starting to wrestle with this whole idea of classically styled modern motorcycles. I mean, you have to understand that at this time, a lot of things were going retro. We saw the rebirth of the Mini Cooper. We saw cars like the PT Cruiser and the Chevy SSR, and it wasn't working on the automobile side, so I think some people were skeptical if it would on the motorcycle side, but in a lot of ways we would see that motorcycles are easier to do retro, almost more like a watch is. Cars are very difficult. But this review really does capture the appeal of a modern classic. All of the fuss of dealing with a classic bike, and especially a classic British bike, something that I'm fairly familiar with having owned a 68 Triumph 500, all of that is gone with this bike, but you do still have that laid-back riding style and overall look. I mean, this is the kind of bike you can't help but look back at when you park it somewhere. And that's what Kawasaki was going for. Sadly, though, the bike would turn out to be a total sales flop here in the States, with Triumph's release of the Bonneville shortly after. Though Triumph didn't quite nail the proportions as well, that platform would prove to be more modern as Triumph evolved it. More than anything, though, Triumph had the heritage for this design. Kawasaki's reimagining just didn't. And so just 2 years after its release here in the States, Kawasaki pulled it from the market and focused just on selling it primarily in Europe and Japan, where it would have, relatively steady sales. As retro and heritage bikes gained popularity in the 2010s, thanks in part to the success of the Triumph Bonneville reboot, Kawasaki re-entered the segment with the W800 in 2011. This new model kept the classic look and bevel drive cam of the W650, but increased displacement to 773cc. There was fuel injection now, refined emissions, and reliability features. Initially, the W800 was again not offered in the US. Kawasaki instead focused on Japan primarily and Europe, but as this segment grew, Kawasaki finally reintroduced it to the American market, this time with multiple variants. There's the W800 Street, which is a stripped down kind of urban style version, the W800 Cafe, which featured a steep cowl and lower bars and a bikini fairing, and then there's the W800 Standard, which is, closest in style to that original W650. But despite the retro market maturing with riders who are more appreciative of this simplicity and of, motorcycles that are character driven and have classic lines, the W series still doesn't sell well here in the States, and again, it's still because of Triumph and of course Royal Enfield. For many, it's tough to justify spending over $10K for a bike that on paper just doesn't match up to what Triumph has to offer with their big twins, and is also on par kind of in many ways with the Interceptor, which is thousands less. Now, what we're talking about is mostly what is on paper, But for those who do choose the W800 and even get an older W650, I think that they view this whole retro motorcycle thing differently. It's not just an aesthetic. These people don't want a modern liquid-cooled, tech-heavy motorcycle dressed up as a classic. They want a bike that truly does embody the spirit of those classic motorcycles, and there are quite a few reasons why the W really does that better than any other model available, even, with what Royal Enfield has to offer. For example, Royal Enfield twins are liquid and air-cooled, and they're also, utilizing the 270-degree firing order. And so, in some ways, a W800 is much more like an original Interceptor than the new Interceptor is. One of the most important things is the fit and finish. The fit and finish of these W motorcycles is incredible. The bike just has this old school charm, and in that way, it's more like those old kind of handcrafted machines. It's also one of the last Kawasaki bikes to be built in Japan, actually at the same factory where that original W series was built. What you're paying for with this motorcycle can't be quantified on a spec sheet. Things like that 360-degree firing order that give you pretty intense vibrations, at least compared to, typical twins. The fact that the bike is made entirely of metal, there's virtually no plastic on it. Also, the dead simple maintenance is another example. Things like valve adjustments are so much simpler than on, say, a Triumph or a Royal Enfield twin. It's a bike for the apocalypse, as some would say, because of its old school simplicity. It's got that under-stressed, low compression engine, and sure, that means it can't hold a candle to Triumph's offerings in terms of power, but on the other hand, it'll go forever. It's super, super reliable, the same way that a classic Japanese bike is. The riding experience will be much closer to that of a classic motorcycle, thanks to things like cable-operated throttle. These are the things that you're paying for, and in that sense, it really is the most authentic modern classic that you can get, having only what's necessary. And sure, these motorcycles might be too expensive for many riders. That's completely fine, but for some, it's exactly what they want, and it offers something unique. And for me, I really respect Kawasaki for continuing to invest in this bike for that niche customer base. And just knowing that this is the same company that developed the H2, I don't know, I just love that about Kawasaki. So big kudos to them. Personally, I would love to own one of these bikes. I just think they're amazing. I would love to hear from you guys. Does the Kawasaki W series speak to you and kind of answer the right questions for you? Let us know your thoughts down below in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one. Ride safe.